Okay. Well, thank you for connecting us. Let me just sort of, yeah. All right. On behalf of the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's lecture. First, a word of thanks to Fiza Shahzad, our graduate assistant, for doing everything to make this event possible. Thank you. And also to the History Department for their logistical support. I'm especially pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Sheetal Chhabria, who teaches history at Connecticut College, South Asian history. Particularly, I say, because it's been endless trying to organize this event. She was originally scheduled to speak at Tufts in April of 2020, but the pandemic put an end to that. And we've had a few changes of times, but not her fault, really more ours. And we were still, we're still having to do this on Zoom, even though I'd hoped that this would change this semester. But nevertheless, I think it's better than nothing. Professor Chhabria is the author of the much acclaimed book, Making the Modern Slum, The Power of Capital in Colonial Bombay, for which she won the American Historical Association's 2020 John F. Richardson Prize for South Asian History. Those who have not yet had a chance to read the work, I think will want to do so after today's lecture, because it's the way in which Professor Chhabria, with her sharp analytical eye, forces us to question certain categories that I think will, she did that extremely well with her previous book, Making of the Modern Slum. She basically makes us think about how the managers of capitalism in governing labor and poverty and the production of the economy really created these various categories, these various ideas. Poverty itself, on this view, is a construct, and its construction is the primary focus of Professor Chhabria's extremely astute historical analysis. She's now working on the multiple failures of decolonization, a lens that will no doubt be informing her talk today on the art of never-ending famine. It's rather apt, I think, that we should be having this talk today when we started the semester with the never-ending war in Afghanistan. So never-ending is, I think, a very interesting concept. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Chhabria. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Jalal, so much for both this invitation and that introduction. I mean, I'm sure you hear this a lot, but I wanted to say it publicly, which is that I used to dislike history very much until I read your sole spokesman. And then I ran over to David Ludden's office and I said, I think I want to do that kind of history. I don't think I do at all do that kind of
history.
Well,
I mean, I'm flattered because I love your book, and I think people should read it if they haven't yet. I think it is extremely well crafted, but I'm looking forward to this particular talk.
Yeah, so I just wanted, it's a long time due that I should have met you, so I'm so glad that we have.
Even though we're meeting on Zoom, but I'm sure that will change
yes,
soon.
I hope that will one day be,
yes.
We'll have a chance to meet in person.
Excellent.
I'm going to share my screen now, just because, let's see, I have to, oh, sorry, hold on one second. There we go. Okay. So this paper, it's actually more of a presentation. It's actually the first time I'm presenting the work I've been wanting to do ever since the end of my first book. It's very much a work in progress in which I'm trying to explore questions that have persisted in my mind ever since I completed that book. And I'm not sure how well it all comes together. I'm especially not good at making some connections explicit between moments of analyses that sort of instinctively or intuitively go together for me, but you could push me on what the connections are or even help me make those connections. I'm also always looking for suggestions of things to read. So I called the presentation Markets and Mortality, the Art of Never-Ending Famine Relief. I'm just going to read the paper now. The story of the Indian subcontinent's hunger and poverty is an all too familiar one. We are probably aware that the Bengal famine of the 1770s claimed 1/3 of Bengal's population, that in the 1870s, some 10 million people perished due to famine, especially in Western and Southern India. And by the 1890s, officials were admitting that some 40 million people remained on the verge of starvation, and that the poverty of India's peasantry and poor far exceeded anything English laborers had ever known. That by 1900, even colonial officials admitted that some 30 million people had died of starvation-related causes, and some 100 million people had become dependent on government relief efforts. In the 1940s, once again, the Bengal famine devastated the population, and the vast majority of the casualties were likely among lower castes. And in general, for all such estimates, a caste component needs to be joined to such statistics to give us a fuller picture of how such inequality and poverty are reproduced. But the story sadly doesn't end upon the end of colonial rule. Perhaps we are less familiar with the fact that upon partition, food riots broke out, the Congress Party being held to its promise of not letting people go hungry. Benjamin Siegel, in his very well-researched Hungry Nation, tells us that some 70 years ago, at the inaugural session of the Food and Agricultural Organization, G.S. Bajpai struggled to quantify India's hunger at the cusp of independence. Before making a plea for technical assistance that would help India attain self-sufficiency, Bajpai cut through the morass of agricultural statistics, suggesting that about a third of the incipient nation's 400 million people were hungry, in spite of what he considered, quote, east of Suez, the best agricultural institute of research in the world, end quote. Siegel goes on to warn that, quote, greater statistical clarity has allowed researchers to paint a sharper, if no less damning portrait of India's contemporary landscape of hunger. A recent Global Hunger Index report offers a grim numerical assessment. In spite of a grain supply large enough to export in droves, 15% of India's citizens remain hungry. India is the second worst fed country in the region, and its index ranking of 28.5 puts it just ahead of Zimbabwe and North Korea. India's levels of malnourishment remain far worse than sub-Saharan Africa's, in spite of far more robust economic growth. That so many in India are so close to the brink of starvation, so immunocompromised by nutritional deprivations, that India remains one of the worst places in the world to get sick is something that still has to be explained. India has the largest number of undernourished people in the world. Malnourishment is India's silent emergency, with higher child malnourishment rates than in sub-Saharan Africa and 5 times as much as in China. TB claims the highest number of lives in India, and 1/5 of maternal deaths and 1/4 of child deaths in the world occurs in India. Amongst children under 5, India has the highest mortality rates worldwide. It spends less than 1.5% of its GDP on health, one of the lowest in the world, even amongst developing countries. Decades of disinvestment and neglect have meant that even after independence, India's disease burden continues to be disproportionately high. Even absent COVID-19, it continues to produce an outsized number of deaths per disease outbreak, with illnesses that have all but disappeared from the developed world, regularly wiping out tens of thousands of inhabitants a year. There is also another story, though, which is that India, colonial or otherwise, was the land of plenty. Much agricultural bounty was exported, and in 1995, this article appeared in Economic and Political Weekly entitled "Too Much Food." As we've heard during the pandemic, the food stocks of the country are grotesquely overdone, some 70 to 90 million tons of food sitting in warehouses. Siegel asks, how would any of the economic thinkers wrestling with poverty at the turn of the last century come to terms with a nuclear nation beeping and chirping with smartphones, satellites, and supermarkets, but which lets 18% of its citizens go hungry? Thus far, the story that I've told you is crafted purposefully to create the impression of a disturbing continuity. It is not an argument or assertion that nothing has ever changed, but the story told in this way compels us to ask what the sources of continuity might be. In the following presentation, there are 3 parts, of which I will focus mostly on the middle one. The first is about the drain of wealth. And what I will argue there is that the version of the drain of wealth theory that becomes predominant provides cover to another version of it that appeared earlier and sometimes later, namely the idea of an internal drain of wealth. The second part will focus on how food shortages, whether you think they are due to natural events, breakdown of entitlements, or a persistent problem of low productivity in the Indian countryside, having to do with either low technology or laziness, all hides the problem of a longer history of labor-capital relations that systematically and structurally produce landlessness or dependency at varying grades and on different scales than upon the nation. And therefore, that relation of labor capital is the substance of repressive relations, which only through slow accretion become institutionalized into state institutions, metrics, and practices. All of this, the systematic production of landlessness or dependency, and the related production of repressive power relations, can simply be called caste or capitalism. The third part will help us will combine the first two to help us understand the very long history of commodification and what Foucault calls biopolitics, although we don't have to use that term, that formed of the means of life, which results in what today Utsa Patnaik calls a republic of hunger. This longer history might even be longer than what Raj Patel has called the long Green Revolution, in which he has extended the politics of the Green Revolution back to the early 20th century, rather than the specific phenomenon that was only named in 1968, 2 years before the program ended. So the first part, so as I mentioned earlier, the version of the drain of wealth theory that becomes predominant provides cover to another version of it that appeared earlier, sometimes later, namely the idea of an internal drain of wealth. This internal drain of wealth, if thought of broadly, includes critiques of Brahmanism, the caste system as a whole, and even Marxist thought that critiqued the landlords and industrialists that the Congress was providing cover to. Such thought was, of course, quite vibrant in the decades before the British finally left, but it had earlier moorings. In an article called Forerunners of Dadabhai Naoroji's Drain Theory by J.V. Naik, Naik tells us that prior to poverty and un-British rule, Marathi Anglo texts and papers carried critiques of British rule that also included criticisms of caste. He cites several from the 1840s and 1850s, but one in particular, written by senior of Naoroji at Elphinstone, named Ram Krishna Vishwanath, was called Thoughts on India's Past, Its Present Condition, and Their Impact on the Future. And this text has been studied by C.A. Bailey and discussed in his Recovering Liberties. Vishwanath also wrote a book called Hindustan Nachi, the first Marathi book on India's history and political economy, published in 1843. This book attributed the growing poverty of the country to two interrelated factors, economic drain and Hindu social obscurantism, and, quote, the social slavery of the caste-ridden Hindu society. Vishwanath also claimed no one had written a book like Adam Smith's for India, where known that labor is the source of wealth. Naik, the person who is studying these texts, also discusses the first Anglo-Marathi newspaper, started in 1832, called the Bombay Darpan, and further discusses this band of early radicals that conceived of the British drain before Naoroji, one saying, quote, it is the priestcraft of the Brahmins that have so far lowered the national character of the Hindus as to be easily governed and even tyrannized over by a handful of foreigners. What all of this amounts to requires much further study than I've done so far, but it does suggest an important rethinking of the drain of wealth, especially since the idea of an internal drain appears sporadically in the thought of Radha Kamal Mukherjee and a few others. Namely, it suggests that if we rethink the specific history of the transformation of colonial power in India in the 19th century, rather than turn it into an ahistorical plunder or nationalized drain of wealth, an internal drain could suggest that we look for the pooling of wealth alongside its drain with an uneven internal geography that is not simply that of rural versus urban, but something much more historically specific. For instance, building on Eric Stokes's argument, much now considered a very dated argument, I'm sure, by some, but building on Eric Stokes's argument that utilitarian thought justified British despotism in India to produce liberal but colonized subjects who would ideally freely choose to participate in British commerce, that is, benefit from the promises of liberal trade, but not immediately obtain political freedom, David Scott marks a transition in the 1830s in the logic of colonial rule, namely a change from a rationale of mercantilism with its territorial annexations to governmentality or an empire of free trade that parallels the abolition of slavery in the Second Empire. The transition from mercantilism to an empire of free trade characterized power's transition to discipline on the cheap through government at a distance. In such a system of cheap governance, increased exchange and commerce helped build the political rationality of liberal governance that would eventually one day manufacture free subjects. In contrast to this possibility for commerce producing political liberalism, in the historiography, a notion of colonial difference has been cited again and again. For instance, Macaulay's infamous Minute on Education has been commented on numerous times for its ethnocentric civilizing impetus in disparaging Oriental texts. But less considered or joined to that discussion is the way he justified this by an appeal to the universal power of commerce to transform even lesser subjects. In other words, it was through trade that India could be included and civilized. And upon the passing of a bill in Parliament in 1833 that barred discrimination in employment in the East India Company based on religion, place of birth, descent, or color, Macaulay stated to the House of Commons in a lecture that, quote, "It would be, on the most selfish view of the case, far better for us that the people of India were well governed and independent of us than ill governed and subject to us, that they were ruled by their own kings, but wearing our broadcloth and working with our cutlery, than they were performing their salams to English collectors and English magistrates, but were too ignorant to value or too poor to buy English manufactures. To trade with," this is still Macaulay, "to trade with civilized men is infinitely more profitable than to govern savages." This aspect of Macaulay's thought, namely that he demeaned Oriental texts in order to civilize Indians so they could participate freely in trade, has been discussed by David Scott as an important turning point in the means and ends of governance. What is also interesting is that this passage by Macaulay was cited by Dadabhai Naoroji in the late 19th century to indict the transfer of wealth as a betrayal of Macaulay's vision. In a section called Non-Fulfillment of Solemn Promises, Naoroji warned of the gap between the ideals of imperial projects and the reality, appealing to Macaulay's vision of India's free participation in commerce. Indian economic nationalism followed this rationale. Namely, it sought to achieve parity through commercial competition, sometimes through policies of protectionism and sometimes through free trade, and most often through both. Only national sovereignty could realize that vision. It was eventually decided. But lost in the struggle was an understanding of an internal drain of wealth. I don't have time to go into more what people like Mukherjee or Rana Day and all said about the internal drain of wealth, but it appears sporadically in their texts. So it's worth thinking about. Oh, sorry. So my second main point is that there's something that we are doing when we talk about food security or insecurity or hunger as poverty that we should be wary of. The subject of India's hunger and famine has produced volumes of texts ever since the late 19th century. Famine galvanized nationalism and produced critiques of imperialism, even inside London. But we shouldn't conflate the two. There were divergent understandings of the causes of famine and a blunter criticism of the inevitable outcomes of the antagonism between capital and labor came from William Hare, a Quaker theosophist, socialist, and radical. Hare claimed that famines, quote, "famines will and must occur so long as India is the field of operations of that mighty tyranny, the empire, whose twin instruments of torture are military oppression and commercial exploitation." I haven't cited Hare here, I don't think, but I just basically picked about whatever the first 7 texts I could find that were on famine, but there's of course so many of them. After the Bengal famine, ongoing and repeated famines proved that the means of producing famine have become more perfect, more relentless, while certainly the means of relief have also become better. In answer to the question, what is a famine, William Hare said, First, it is well to say that a famine is not a failure of rainfall, nor a failure of crops, nor an abnormal export, nor the locking up of food, nor a rise in the price of grain, nor a scarcity of money. Secondly, neither can it be said that a famine is necessarily the product of all these conditions, though sometimes it may be. A famine is a condition of widespread starvation arising from the inability of the people, from any cause whatever, to get the food their bodies need. Thus, there's a famine 365 days in the year in London, where 1 million people are in a state of chronic want. There's plenty of food, the crops do not fail, and prices are low. The condition of poverty makes it impossible for these people to buy sufficient food at their present prices. If prices rise, they are worse off. If through external causes, prices should rise abnormally and supplies be temporarily cut off, this million people would die like flies or like Indians, end quote. In this definition, Hare sought to draw attention to a common process traversing the globe, one that did not exempt even metropolitan London from its effects. Perhaps more powerfully, he sought to overcome the eventfulness of the famine. It was not a particular crisis at a particular time, indicating a rupture from normalcy. Rather, it was the inevitable outcome of imperial priorities that impoverished even Londoners. Given these powerful critiques, what more could we or I possibly say about famine or hunger that hasn't already been stated? What does this recurrence of famine outrage tell us? And that's a genuine question, by the way. I've been wondering about that, and maybe there isn't something new to be said, but maybe there is. There's a remarkable discussion of what Foucault calls scourge. I don't know if I'm saying that right, S-C-O-U-R-G-E, in Foucault's lectures, Security, Territory, and Population. Foucault describes the transformations that happen to the problems of famine, scarcity, and dearth under the new impetus to govern that emerges alongside the rise of the physiocrats in the 18th century France. Their interest in agrarian wealth and agrarian improvements, and the way that logic serves the formation of wealth and liberalism simultaneously. We could follow his historicization to provide our own historicization of the emergence of hunger and food insecurity, and even the later right to food campaigns as historically specific and contingent phenomenon or problematics, which is to say, in other words, of course, some portion of people have been hungry for a very long time. We can go back to the pre-modern period and find instances of sovereigns or religious institutions providing grains or meals as a performance of both sovereign power and for the simple fact of relief from hunger. We might remember even fondly that the Mughal system of taxation was much more flexible than the British and the permanent settlement, or that a practice of poor relief was to, on special occasions, distribute wealth to the destitute in a sum equivalent to the sovereign's weight. But understanding how we got from there to here would require writing a history not just of the presence of widespread hunger or the episodes of famine, but adding to that the question of which problem was relief trying to solve in each instance. How did those problems change over time? And what does that tell us about the ends or purposes of governance, and why some problems remain or even get worse? A key part of understanding this is to locate continuity and change differently than has been done thus far in the historiography. As I discussed above, David Scott has critiqued narratives of colonial difference that argue that a colonial line between colonizer and colonized produced a kind of space of exception in India. Instead, the 1830s mark a shift from mercantilist sovereignty to governance of spaces of liberalism and commerce. Understanding this requires noting how the ends of governments change, not just for the colonial state, which is an untenable abstraction in the 1830s that leads scholars to reproduce the very state effect they ought to be critiquing, but for the various institutional sites of governance on the ground, occupied for the most part by natives rather than Englishmen. My point is this, that ongoing agricultural crises, droughts, scarcity, hunger, starvation, deaths, disease, and repeated land alienations and consolidations reveal the growing power of an alliance between merchants, landlords, creditors, and the colonial state. And colonial priorities produce famine in every decade from the 1770s through the entirety of the 19th century. This is a chart that William Hare made himself to indict British rule, showing that as it goes on the top axis, every decade there's a famine somewhere or the other in colonial India. These ongoing famines certainly galvanize anti-imperial thought and action, critiques spanning British, Indian, liberal, moderate, and radical positions, but the famines also instigated rationales of rule that only further conjoined the power of caste and capital. And so this, I think, is my main point that I've begun exploring, is that famine relief became, in the colonial period, a form of labor control. In other words, alleviating poverty by the provision of food or grain was a means of controlling labor, and not just controlling labor in the individual sense, to control this, that, or the other person, but of means of controlling labor at the level of the population. The genealogy of this as a practice takes us deep into the labor history of the subcontinent, much of which begins before colonial rule, stuff I don't have time to fully explore here. I spoke about this a bit in my first book, when the Famine Commission was formed in the late 19th century, and famine relief on the outskirts of the city of Bombay served to distinguish and classify laboring bodies into skilled versus unskilled, deserving or undeserving of relief, and debates were had about just how much relief would dampen as opposed to induce laborers to get back to work. But the Famine Commission didn't start this process, or at least that kind of thinking can be found even prior. One second set of records that I found is from something called the Monegar Choltri in Madras in the 1830s, which also evinced discussions among the managers of the Choltri, which is basically a poor relief site where grain is given to victims of starvation and famine. And in these records, there are debates over how much grain should we give so as not to create permanent dependence. This kind of thinking eventually leads to calculations that are made even amongst economists today. And in fact, a lot of these sort of randomized control trials that you may have heard of that won the Nobel in 2019 are about figuring this kind of thing out, just how little state support can we provide so as to both produce relief plus induce the return to work. The practice of begar, or which is a sort of informal labor system, or even food for work on what are essentially slave plantations or desolate colonies of surplus labor, are also part of this logic and are certainly older than colonial rule. So in other words, through the numerous texts and practices, texts and speeches on famine and hunger, which is certainly important and opens up a political space of anti-imperial thought, they still end up substituting an effect for a cause, substituting hunger for inequality and impoverishment. But the more pernicious thing is that we struggle to see how poverty relief, given through the giving of food, gets used again and again as a means to control labor. To understand how this happened, we could begin with the text from 1895 by Prithvi Chandra Ray, hold on 1 second, which is called The Poverty Problem in India, being a dissertation on the causes and remedies of Indian poverty. It was dedicated to his mother for first inspiring him to study, quote, the great problem of our national poverty. In this, he critiqued free trade, saying here in India, protective tariffs were practically abolished before 1848. And yet after the lapse of about half a century, though the land blooms and grows with unabated bounty, waving with yellow harvests, nearly 1/5 of her people in the year of grace, 1895, are on the actual verge of starvation. Here was what became a common concern, which is that colonial India produced a lot. It just didn't feed the primary producers. He said later that, quote, 70% of her people toiling and drudging day and night to eke out an honest living by tilling the soil is driving fast, God only knows to what fate. And after a discussion of trade imbalances, more exports and imports, says, quote, drainage of so much of our wealth to England because we export the necessities of life in exchange for importing luxuries. It is surprising, by the way, how this is a very similar discussion to what occurs in Utsa Patnaik's Republic of Hunger, written almost a century later, except in that latter book, financialization since the 1970s has caused exports to rise, but not a return in food imports for the masses, as would be predicted by standard economic theory. Free trade and lack of protectionism for the poorest are also discussed in Patnaik. However, the difference in Patnaik is followed by a discussion of how urban elites can raise their share of the growth in wealth. This is something I will return to later. In Ray's discussion, he speaks of drainage of wealth quite often. He advocates for protectionism for nascent industries and even says, quote, a country with untold resources, splendid aptitude for production and cheap labor, such as India, can shortly make more than make good this loss by rising equal to the occasion which protection creates. This is in many ways kind of a disturbing thing to say, that India should always have cheap labor, to concede, in other words, that protectionism will cause losses for India's economy as a whole, but that cheap labor will make up for it. Now, later in the book, he does talk about increasing the power of labor in relation to landlords, but the specifics aren't clear, nor is this a coherent vision for change. This is in many ways the outcome of the conception of the drain of wealth that becomes most prominent, namely protectionism for India so that as a nation she can commercially compete, grow industry, etc. It is an early account of modernization, and it's also a kind of mercantilist nationalism. The main thing done in Ray is that in his discussion, poverty is replaced often with the discussion of hunger, because as he sees it, poverty is experienced as hunger. According to Raj Patel's article, The Long Green Revolution, Foucault's conception of biopolitics helps us understand, quote, how problems of hunger, poverty, injustice, and ecological destruction have been understood through the prism of capitalism. In other words, that hunger becomes the central problem and not something else, helps hide something, that something else that is central to capitalism. This is why capitalism is a prism, the thing one sees through rather than what one sees. The number of studies there are of biopolitics, for instance, that are completely unmoored from questions of class power or that comply with maintaining capitalism as a prism rather than what we see, only reveals how powerful biopolitics is in obscuring capitalist relations. Studies of health, sexuality, or even the carceral system ought to reveal how health, sexuality, or the carceral system support capitalist logics. In the case of the history of unwanted hunger, which again has existed for a long time, Foucault's analysis explains how hunger goes from a scourge to a chimera. Scourge is something which one dreads, whereas chimera is something that may appear ever receding but never fully disappears. Before discussing his analysis, I would take minor issue with Raj Patel's characterization of Foucault, because Foucault would have not used the word capitalism in his analysis. The changes in terminology mattered deeply, and the challenge was to explain why, for instance, the word individual gave way to population in government records. He didn't use capitalism because it would have implied a unity or a coherence of a system. Instead, the relevant words were individual, scourge, hunger, population, and market. And by the word market, he didn't mean the abstract market, but the market in a particular grain, as in the particular price and quantity in a particular time. In Foucault's discussion of the rise of the physiocrats, Foucault described the way in which a prior juridical disciplinary system, there was the need to get rid of scarcity through disciplinary laws. So there may have been prohibitions against hoarding or selling, and grain merchants would have operated undercover, fearful of the state's prohibitions and punishments. There would have been rules, he says, quote, people will be compelled to sow at least a minimum amount, or the cultivation of this or that crop will be prohibited. Essentially, there would be a series of controls on prices, storing, export, and cultivation. This would have been a part of the mercantilist period, wherein this anti-scarcity system is basically focused on a possible event, an event that could take place and which one tries to prevent before it becomes reality. But there were failures of this older system, which were sought to be corrected through a new system. And these failures included one, that as the price was kept so low through all the rules, peasants would not even cover their cost of production. And two, that because of the first problem, peasants will sow less. And if they sow less, then any climactic variation might leave them with too little. In sum, so the politics of the lowest possible price exposes one to the risk of shortages at every moment, and so precisely the scourge it sought to avoid. In other words, the disciplinary and juridical system was not effective. So to solve it, a new set of mechanisms and ends of power needed to be designed. This is when the new goal became not anti-scarcity, but the freedom of liberalism, or the freedom of commerce and of the circulation of grain, to be laid down as the fundamental principle of economic government. In this logic of power, scarcity of grain is not an evil, but a natural event. And the question of morality is rejected. So it is neither good or bad, nor good nor evil. It simply is. In this new system, the rise in the price is encouraged by encouraging exports and discouraging imports. Price rises themselves are said to induce more production. And in some, so there will no longer be any scarcity in general, on condition that for a whole series of people in a whole series of markets, there was some scarcity, some dearness, some difficulty in buying wheat, and consequently some hunger. And it may well be that some people die of hunger after all. But by letting these people die of hunger, one will be able to make scarcity a chimera and prevent it occurring in this massive form of the scourge typical of the previous systems. Thus, the scarcity event is split. The scarcity scourge disappears, but scarcity that causes the death of individuals not only does not disappear, it must not disappear. End quote. In this way, scarcity doesn't disappear, but the goal of government and the measure of government becomes not the reduction of scarcity, but the change of scarcity from a scourge into a chimera, which is, to repeat, scourge is something one dreads. It would have delegitimized older governments, whereas chimera is something that can be made to appear ever receding, but never fully disappears, seemingly like an illusion. The main way this happens is by making the object of government the population and not the series of individuals. Individuals still exist, but they are instrumental. And here we can think of the way in which records keeping on behalf of the state changes and starts to speak of the population as a whole, its norms and deviations, and the rise of demography, that is the science of population, is the outcome or even perfection of this. So given the longer continuity alerted to at the beginning of this presentation, and given this transition of hunger serving as a scourge, something that governments are scared of because they delegitimize them, and turning into a chimera, something that looks like it is always receding but never actually does, we can ask ourselves, what are the deeper structures of power that account for not the resolution of the problem of hunger, but its distribution, or hunger's distribution onto new sites? Famine relief normalized and made endemic not only hunger, but related ailments for some populations over others well into the 20th century. The main purpose of colonial era famine relief was to govern labor, that is, render labor less docile, less dependent, and incite it or induce it to more productivity. Further, famine relief more often than not obscured and mystified the common origins of caste and capital. As we have learned from Rupa Vishwanath, the caste-state nexus was a structural feature of accumulation projects on land and in agriculture, but also, as we can see, through relief projects that spanned agriculture, commerce, and industry in colonial India. This caste-state nexus coalesced along a rural to urban continuum that orbited around cities and commercial centers, creating coercive networks of control that produced indebtedness, provisioned shelter, engaged in charity and relief works, and intersected in voluntary associations of reforms. More often than not, even investments in agriculture to prevent famine in advance, as David Washbrook said, subvented caste-based privileges. By the early 1950s, solving hunger was central to nationalist legitimacy. When the Congress inherited the government, one of its earliest promises was to never let colonial era famines prevail again. But how to do this? The options were either grow more food or pursue a better distribution of the food that the country had, basically pursue equity. You can read more about that tussle in Benjamin Siegel's Hungry Nation, but in the end, growth won out over equity. You might recall that the picture of too much food in the Economic and Political Weekly article cited, or that I showed earlier, which was from 1995. It's also the case that in 1970, according to many estimates, India had enough food in her stores to feed everyone. In 1946, the ration card scheme was first instituted in Bombay. It illustrates very well the problem with focusing on governing food rather than labor, because rationing, as S.K. Rudra, the economic advisor to the UP government, said when rationing had been proposed in 1942, he said of it then that it had been somewhat of an academic idea. Yet now a robust food control system had forced Indians, he said, quote, physically and ideologically to share the common hunger of the country, end quote. But sharing in the hunger of the country was never going to work. It flattened the power and purchasing disparities into a fiction of national equality, one that upper classes would never concede. Even Gandhi insisted on the decontrol of food for the pedagogical lessons it could offer in spite of the lives lost. In many ways, he was trying to warn of this. Even when decontrol was over, this experiment with decontrol that happened in 1947, Congress was too beholden to traders and big farmers to take meaningful action. Lack of meaningful action was the key to perpetuating hunger in such a way that it could become a chimera. And pulling a lot of levers of how this happened was the development of the science of economics, in which India played a major role and still does. Successive governments and ministers wanted to either increase food production regulate food trade, stop hoarding, create a national stockpile for emergency use, ration and therefore ask everyone to consume less, or all of the above. In fact, all of the above was most often pursued, and these were all at odds with each other. Often increasing food production required deregulating trade so as to motivate more productivity, and rationing required regulating trade, which angered the merchants and chambers of commerce. So rationing was pursued half-heartedly. Whenever controls were tried, the number of counter-revolutionary protests by merchants and their representatives is astonishing. The tight grip they had on government policy was true then just as it is now. Whatever you want to call it, the anti-politics machine, the repressive state apparatus, or said in a positive sense, the evolution of the art of government in which imperfections in governance serve as opportunities to perfect the management of the population is very well developed in India. So much so that even criticisms and protests of government often demand better governance and better management rather than question the political economic system upon which that government rests. Some of the reasons given for the current Republic of Hunger are a prior colonial era overtaxation of the peasantry that reduced their purchasing power, or export-oriented policies that systematically incentivized money lenders and large holders to intervene in and consolidate their hold over agricultural output, and disinvestment in the kinds of technologies that would have increased overall output. Another reason going back to the 1970s is a pro-business and pro-market orientation of the state that has invited the recolonization of the countryside and agricultural co-optation by elites. For Utsa Patnaik and others, between the 1950s and 1970s, there was a brief increase in nutritional standards and purchasing power, which was then once again undermined by the rise of financial capital. But is this story really true? And if it is true, what is the explanation for this brief corrective? But if it's not true, why do we believe this to be true? Could it be a distorted aggregate? In many ways, it probably is a distorted aggregate because all the details of where food relief happened and where it didn't are key. The detailed narrative that emerges from the literature is that the Green Revolution, for instance, was grafted onto an already uneven and consolidated field of power in which agrarian capitalists, powerful peasants and their lobbies, dealers of agrarian inputs, gain again and again. They do so by succeeding or winning a decades-long battle over the fate of India's national agriculture, in which visions of cooperative farming are conceded against the onslaught of the constant claim that India simply does not produce enough food to feed its people, and so must produce more. In other words, in the debate over equity versus growth, growth wins. Decades later, in the early 2000s, corridor projects, highways, thoroughfares, urban complexes of transport and cultivation, or commercial agriculture, slowly displaced by realtors and construction projects, once again graft gains onto already powerful agents. In one instance, in the work of Sai Balakrishnan, she has shown how the sugar industry, the already powerful sugar lobby of Western India, gained from the national corridor projects. Sai Balakrishnan has also written an article in Scroll, which I highly recommend. The title is right there in the source. India's brutally uneven development patterns are mapped in routes migrant workers are taking home. What is remarkable is the way in which distress migration during the pandemic lockdown could be mapped onto those older patterns. What we see is that geographical unevenness is produced and bolstered by articulating local power relations with national visions of growth, thereby exploiting even further those whom growth has left behind for decades. This is a story certainly of continuity of power and wealth amidst rapid changes in the economy. It allows us to see how even as a lot changes, so much stays the same. The question is really, how does the government's insistence on maintaining the private food markets, grain dealers, money lenders, landlords, agricultural businesses, while at the same time purporting to care for the hungry, prevent it from solving the problem? And what are the best bets for decommodification? Land trusts managed by cooperatives, rationing work when paired with well-planned public goods regimes, so that compromising consumption is paired with benefits. But all this is very hard to pull off. But the truthful and more longer history of India is it's a place that's been held hostage by enterprising capitalists who disappear under the cover and guise of external colonialism, and then under the need for development, which includes the Grow More Food campaign, get away with privatizing even further. What we find when we look at this longer history of continuity is that India is governed through food. And so there are continuities between colonial era famine commissions and the randomized controlled trials, or food for work programs, the right to food campaigns, even Narega in some instances. All are in between as sites of contestation and paths not taken. But whenever food is given in place of poverty relief, we should be wary of the control of the laboring population. In conclusion, and returning to Putnam's criticism of the Republic of Hunger, we can add this quote by Mike Davis about how the urban elite live in fantasies of elsewhere. This is sort of what, let me try and read this quote to you. In this gilded captivity of the third world urban bourgeoisie cease to be citizens of their own country and become nomads belonging to and owing allegiance to a super-terrestrial topography of money. They become patriots of wealth, nationalists of an elusive and golden nowhere. So I think the Davis quote is much more radical than it's a Putnam's take, but I do think that what we're starting to see by a critique of this sort of Republic of Hunger is the resurgence of a deeper Marxist thinking in more mainstream thought. But the critique of India's elites is only beginning. Until we grapple with that, the way in which an internal drain of wealth is continuing and relief programs that provide food for work are not points of relief for the population and are not the end of colonial era famines, but exemplify the art of never-ending famine relief, in which new kinds of institutionalization of labor and poverty keep hunger and precarity going at just the tolerable level to achieve the aim of governing the population in such a way that a large surplus laboring population is always available to grow the wealth of the country. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was a fascinating talk. But I actually see you as leading, and I mean, well, you're certainly among those who critique the post-colonial state in India, which hasn't happened very much, because as you rightly point out, there's much more about the drain of wealth than the internal drain theory, or the configurations of power that make endless continuity possible, even when supposedly they're trying to sort out the problem. So famine relief as a form of labor control, I think, reminds me a lot of your excellent analysis of poverty as a construction. So they seem to be going hand in glove largely. But what do you do when, I mean, you're bringing a certain sort of thinking to bear on how we read things. And I think that's extremely important methodologically. But at the end of the day, my question to you is that now that we've understood that it's all about sustaining privilege, not solving problems, what are we going to do? I mean, it's not even that you're proposing a proposal. This is about power. So, I don't think you have an answer, but I've understood and I like it. I think we're going to need to do this for a lot more before we can begin to find a way to address it. But I mean, it is extremely, extremely interesting. But just one other thing I wanted to share with you. Listening to you about food reminded me of, a man who's frequently described as a nutcase, Allama Anayatollah Mashriqi, who on the eve of partition suggested that the currency of India should be grain because it's a food deficit country. I encourage you to have a look at that. It's a really fascinating suggestion. So, I mean, at some level, I suppose you come up with ideas to solve the problem, but I thought he was the most imaginative. And he's always treated as a bit of a madcap. But I do think that at one level he had a point. Thank you so much again.
Sure. Do you want to respond to you, or would you like us to take more questions?
Oh, you can respond to me, and then we can open it up if you like.
Okay. Yeah. Before giving this talk, whenever I give a talk like this, I always chastise myself, and I think I'm such a boring person. I'm pretty much just a Marxist who thinks that labor capital relations sort of explain everything. But I think the interesting thing in the history and his
Oops. Hello. Sorry, we lost you there. Is that? Are you there?
Yes, I am here, but I think her internet just got cut for a second. I'm sure she'll be back in a minute.
Okay, sure.
Sorry, did I get lost there?
Yes, yes, we're going to have to repeat whatever you were trying to tell us.
Okay, so I always think to myself, I'm just a sort of simple person who thinks labor capital relations are really the key to everything. And yet there's the fact that that simple fact is obscured in such fancy ways in both India's history and its historiography. And it sometimes then takes a lot of work to get back there, right? So what's to be done? I think I'm always struck when I'm sitting in the US how much criticism there is of the wealthy in the US. And it seems almost impossible to make that criticism in India.
No, that's, I think, an excellent point. But that's what my takeaway from your paper, if not the book to be, is that it's just a methodological. I mean, you know, you're proposing a new methodology of interpreting India. I mean, that's what struck me about your first book.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you know, that's, I think, the primary, because I mean, in terms of what we are supposed to do, I mean, it's going to be a battle. It's a conflict. I mean,
yeah. I mean, this goes back, I guess, to those debates over like Cambridge School versus subaltern studies. I mean, but in so many ways, we have to move far beyond that and just simply look at, in the much smaller scale, rather than presuming the nation, look at how wealth is accumulated and how people are deprived of wealth. And that's a sort of very basic question that it takes a lot to uncover.
No, but I do think, Sheetal, that is quite remarkable that 70 years onwards in South Asia, there is such little, I mean, there's so much positivism in interpretation. I mean, I think the lawyers take the cake there, but I do think that it sort of is all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that sense, I think my takeaway, at least that's how I'm taking away. I want to read much more on Famine, but I think this is methodological and very important. And I think you should open it up now to the others, please.
Sure. So we currently have 2 questions in. So the first question from Padmani Barua is the question that must be asked in context of the farmers' protest. What kind of history repeating itself are we seeing? And is the Indian state echoing colonial state practice? Have these practices contributed to the 200 million plus hungry people today in India? Are we looking at a prospective famine for a substantial class caste with a corporatization planned in the new bills?
Right. So, I mean, I think the latest with the attempt to get rid of the minimum support, I mean, the Mundis and whatnot, and the minimum support prices is obviously a sort of next step in assault on regulations in the food system. With the farmers' protests, and I am not someone who is an expert on Punjab's agrarian history, so I would have to defer to people, but I would warn of one thing, which is that there is a longer history in the subcontinent of middling peasants or wealthy peasants rising up to claim rights on behalf of all peasants. And that can obscure the class relations that occur amongst middle peasants and lower peasants. So I'm not saying that is exactly what's happening with the farmers' protest, but someone has to go and do the work of asking, well, whose interests do the farmers at the farmers' protest represent? And whose interests are not being spoken of. And that's, I'm not, you know, there are other people who have written about that and raised that concern, but every protest, every movement always has the possibility for opening and including the lowest, you know, even low caste or outcast people, but it also has the possibility of appropriating outcast people, landless laborers, on behalf of something that they wouldn't gain from. So I think it's a very, very complicated question that deserves someone to go and do the work of, you know, going and asking and hanging out at the protest and figuring out what's going on.
Dr. Jalal, you're muted.
Sorry, but I want to sort of press this further. You know, your supervisor, one of your supervisors, Partha Chatterjee, in his lectures, recently published lectures, I Am the People, talks about liberalism and intersectionality. And I mean, a lot of questions, I mean, the two questions you have are about the farmers' movement. And I wanted to ask you whether you thought that this intersectional, the lack of mobilization that has been possible, and the fact that sectionality is, people are just, even the farmers seem to be operating in their little space. To what extent has that sort of altered the control of labor? Are they in a better position to control? I'm just wondering how you read that. I mean, so it seems to be a better form of controlling.
Yeah, it is. Like I said, it's an open moment in which something positive could come out of it, but we cannot decide that in advance, right? And I guess whether it's intersectional, I mean, that it really requires someone to go and examine the situation. But I don't think we should assume that just because they're farmers or they're called peasants, that they represent the interests of everybody. And yeah, I would just leave that as a question, I guess, for someone to be vigilant about, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, Dr. Bose actually has his hand raised and he would like to speak, I think, and ask you a question.
Can you, yes, go ahead, please ask the question. Where is he? How do we bring him in?
I just unmuted him so he can talk now.
Okay, fine. You've been unmuted. You can talk.
Yeah, so he just needs to unmute his.
And he's unmuted himself. We can't see you.
Well, you don't need to see me. It's just that I found it difficult to pose a question on chat, because this was such a thoughtful but complex talk. And as you know, I was an agrarian historian in an earlier incarnation and have written about famine. And I think that I was a bit surprised when you referred to yourself as a simple Marxist. In fact, in this particular paper, you were expressing some reservations about, say, Utsa Patnaik's book, Republic of Hunger, which is in some ways an orthodox Marxist take on hunger in post-colonial India. And I think you were being more of a Foucauldian, trying to interpret the continuity between colonial and post-colonial as a move from hunger and scarcity as scourge to chimera. I have two questions, really. I like what you're trying to do by wanting to focus our attention on the internal drain, something that the drain of wealth theory has tended to obscure. But in talking about the internal drain, you could think in terms of many fractures, many lines of inequity or subalternity. But it seemed to me that you wanted to really talk about caste as being absolutely critical, even more than class or gender. You could think about other forms of inequity. And I wanted to hear you speak a little bit more about why you think it is caste which is so crucial in this respect. And the second question, or a slight doubt that I have, that in generally speaking, I think your argument works well, that unending famine relief is really a form of labor control. But it works better for chronic hunger, I would say, malnutrition. Perhaps it works less well in the context of really major famines, because if you think about the Bengal famine of 1943, for example, there was no famine relief. Certainly no government organized famine relief. The famine code was not invoked. A famine was not acknowledged. And that's what led to large scale deaths, excess mortality, and so on. So so in some ways your argument seems to work better for the period of chimera, that where you can keep labor just about alive. And so that was the other. And I really think that we need to focus more on the forms of inequality that you want to write about. I mean, even if you just look at Piketty's index, I mean, in India, if you look at wealth inequality, the top 1% controls 40% of wealth. And in terms of income inequality, the top 1% controls 20% of income. And yet, you're right that, I mean, there is gross inequity in the United States, but there is also a discourse which really, takes on the 1%. And we don't seem to be able to do it effectively in the Indian context. And Modi now is talking about an Anna Utsav, while leaving sort of labor, completely sort of decimated, disenfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, you've given me so much to think about, and I'll try and respond, maybe not in the order you said it, but as the ideas come to me. But one thing about the Marx and Foucault thing, I think it's also a shame how much Indian Marxism, not all of it, but much of Indian Marxism was actually influenced by modernization theory and got in line with the idea of the net growth of the national wealth and all this stuff. And this is what even Benjamin Siegel discusses in his debate, reviewing the debate on equity versus growth. It was the fundamental question, I guess, is like, does India have enough food to feed everybody? Or do we need to produce more food? And if you need to stimulate growth, which many Marxists agreed with, then you have to act on a different kind of person and a different kind of operation than if you're trying to alleviate poverty. I'll just say a simple thing. Whenever one is trying to correct for a power imbalance, it is never corrected simply by raising one side. Somebody has to give up something. And I think this is what comes up when we talk about the farmers' protests today and whatnot. I don't think we have that idea in place that it is right for some people to give up some wealth in order for somebody else to have it, right? And yeah, so I'll say that. But regarding your comment about the Bengal famine in the 1940s not even being recognized as a famine, and that what I'm arguing for might be more pertain more to just constant amounts of hunger and starvation, I think that's exactly right. This is why I use the phrase never-ending famine relief, because there's a way in which, even I've been thinking a lot about COVID-19 and the way in which we are now going to have to witness the process of a pandemic becoming endemic, meaning going to have to become normal. How do you normalize this thing? And that's something I bet hundreds of people in government right now are working on. What's the kind of messaging that's going to be given? What kinds of statistics are going to have to be removed from the public eye, and which ones are going to have to be put out there, so that COVID becomes something that's just another thing. And we can start to accept that just as so many people die of TB, which should never happen, so many people will die of COVID, right? And so that kind of endemicity, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. And there's a way in which what counts as normal in India is so very disturbing that we have to work that much harder to not render it normal. Regarding caste, I'm very influenced by Rupa Vishwanath's book, The Pariah Problem. If people haven't read it, I can't recommend it more highly. I think that book really opened my eyes in so many ways, because it made me realize that a lot of what we talk about when we talk about agricultural labor is really low caste people rather than the landless or Dalits. And you all, might remember Dharma Kumar's work many years ago, in which he showed that actually landlessness was a problem even before the British got there, but that was sort of treated amongst historians, at least in the US, as an inconvenient truth, something that did not actually disrupt the way we told the story of colonialism. We still told the story of colonialism as if it was some radical break with the past and as if it had singularly impoverished the subcontinent. But in fact, for many people, they were impoverished for a long time. So I think there is something about caste as labor control, or caste as the networks through which one can accumulate capital or acquire jobs, or that is so pervasive and so everyday, that it is the thing, and because it's so normal, it can be rendered invisible. There's many, many forms of, what I really want to do with this project, by the way, is root it in Western India. And it's not right now. Right now it's very, I've read a bunch of things about famine and the historiography and whatnot, but it's not rooted in a location. What I would love to do is root it in a location and be able to say, and Western India is the one I know best, and then be able to say, okay, well, let's look at how landlessness is produced again and again, or even inscribed in deeper ways, while at the same time, the rise of certain low castes is created. And that would allow us to see the way in which stratification and hierarchies are formed and grafted on to older relations of caste that include now new forms of capitalist accumulation. So that's sort of like my most ambitious goal. And that's how I think of caste. I really think caste as the way it is in the US among scholars of racial capitalism. You wouldn't think of eradicating racism without eradicating capitalism. I don't think it's possible to think of eradicating or annihilating caste without annihilating capitalism. And I do think there were people in the 20th century who knew that. But now we have to work hard to recover those visions, I think. I don't know if that answers your questions, but I really appreciate all the comments you provided.
Well, Sheetal, I also sort of just listening to you and responding to Shugata's question, I was thinking of Amartya Sen's famous statement that chronic hunger doesn't disturb the system as much as acute hunger does. But really, I mean, I think that the differentiations of sort of chronic hunger and acute famine, I think that's really what's defining this question of why it is accepted. But I mean, you know, what do you think it will take to really shake it up? I mean, yes, academic work, but I mean, what will it require for this to be, I mean, to really be called into question?
I'm not actually a big believer in academic work, to tell you the truth. I think there was just I just got something from Haymarket Books today that said the title was Reproductive Rights Begin in the Streets. I think all this stuff begins in the streets.
It's politics. Ultimately, it's going to require a kind of politics to address this question.
Yeah.
But I do think that your book is very important because I don't think that people see it in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, that's what I meant by this positivist way of presenting things.
Since I have the chance to say it, let me just say, one of my friends, Maya Ramnath, who left the academy, actually, she said to me something very interesting once. She said, it used to be the case that academics / intellectuals, journalists, and labor organizers sat in the same room together often. We don't do that anymore.
That's that's neoliberalism. I mean, that's part of the problem.
Right. Exactly.
Of how we don't network anymore. We are sectional.
Yeah. So I really think academics have to sort of get on the ground, and I don't mean we should stay in our lane, but I think we have to participate in conversations about strategy and about what needs to be done in ways that maybe people decades before us used to, but now we're, sadly, I don't think writing the book will do much, but one can try. It's what I got, so.
Are there any other people who want to either raise their hands or ask a question? Because this is an opportunity. I see that Prasannan is here. Prasannan, I mean, I don't mean to sort of call on you, but I want to certainly give you an opportunity. There's Iram's hand is up. Can I give it to her? Allow her to talk? Yes, Iram, there you are. You're muted.
Thank you so much. So I'd also like to, I think maybe just, like an oral question is easier to frame. What I wanted to ask you about is, can you help us think, because I've really been trying to follow the role of female farmers who have been organizing also as part of now this 2-year-long movement. And for the first time, they are really seeing themselves and saying, look, we have been doing farm work, basically forever, but no one has actually acknowledged that that is farm work. We have seen it as family work. Just we are keeping our families going. All of us work on these lands. This is what we do. So when you go and ask them about, do you understand that there's a rights-based framework or there's any of that? They say, look, none of this is relevant to us. So I take your point about, interestingly, maybe that's like either an activist or an academic, sort of framing, but the actual women on the ground have a different conceptualization of their work and labor. So if you could just help us think a little about women in this whole story, I think that would be very, very helpful. Thanks.
One thing I can say is I remember reading that in the 1940s, 50s, when there was the campaign to grow more food, it was women and housewives that were mobilized as, like, I guess every woman was supposed to, like, in addition to doing all the domestic work, also have a little garden where she grew food for her family or something, or maybe even on the balcony. I mean, I don't know what to say other than women are often conscripted into these projects of growth or nation building in ways that are so damaging. That's, sort of banal to say. But there was, before you got to the women part, there was something else you were saying, though, which I thought was maybe disconnected from the question about women, but about the way in which people were rejecting the notion that a rights discourse was what they needed, right? Is that what you were getting at?
That's what I understand from what they are saying, that they don't, they look at it in one way, they don't look at it within this other framing.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the things that I didn't say in my paper, but I've been thinking about, is the way in which, I mean, other people have said this too, Sam Moyne, but like a rights-based discourse is in many ways such a compromise on labor agitation, right? Because claiming rights is something that'll take you through the legal system. But claiming the spoils of your production is something that gets you out on the streets and gets you into direct confrontation with your oppressor. So I do think, I mean, I don't know what the people meant, but that's at least how I think of it.
And I think that's really right. Interestingly, again, these are, this is not coming from a woman, but a male sort of, again, a farmers' work union leader has said that one of the things that they very much mistrust is this, government appointed, Supreme Court appointed commission, because they're saying, well, all of the members are exactly, supporters of the government. So if we go to them, we know the outcome we'll get. So yes, I think there is an awareness, there is an instinctive understanding that going into this way of negotiating is going to bind you and you will not like the outcome.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I'm glad to hear that actually, because I think that this is an instance of, I think, how scholars should follow the people rather than, presuming to tell people what to do. But like, if there's an instinctive or imminent concern about a rights-based discourse or the legal system or the way in which constitutionalism can or cannot help people, then I think we should take that seriously and come up with a different theory then of what causes oppression or change or something like that.
Thank you.
There is a question from Prasannan that you want to look at.
Yes. Should I say that, or would you like to read it?
I can just, it says, in your approach, laborers are acted upon, but do not seem to act. What kinds of projects are they engaged in around the question of hunger? This is a whole other strand of, I've started collecting notes on just what I would call a sort of counter movement to this kind of oppressive thing. But there's, of course, food riots. There's, I mean, Professor Parthasarathi knows this better than I do, but the amount of sort of agitations that happen to withhold labor, to ask for debt relief, all sorts of things. There's quite a vibrant labor protest. I don't know what more to say about that than that. I'd love to hear actually his thoughts on it. But.
I think it's a question of Prasannan seeing it as that labor came out static. I think that's not your intention in the least bit. But I mean, you you're framing an argument.
Mhm.
But I mean, you would see the relationship between labor and capital as a negotiated process, and it's onwards and constantly being renegotiated, even if there is an asymmetry of power, which you delineate quite well.
I think in this instance, caste really matters too, because I think a lot of the formalized labor agitations through the Communist Party and whatnot are often exclusive of caste relations, and they therefore tend to reproduce a kind of casteism, you know. But that sort of has to be worked out too and looked at more closely.
So, I mean, in a sense, should we also say that given the fact that you are thinking through not just a new project, but perhaps, you know, also sort of suggesting that there's a need for a new kind of politics, the politics of the street. It seems that that's really what's on the cards. Ultimately, that will come out of your book of what's really needed. But I think you're a little too, I mean, dismissive of all academic work. I mean, I think that it's the intention with which it is done. And I think yours is quite clearly one aimed at making a difference. Or would you say that's not even something you're attempting to do?
No. I mean, of course, I'm not an academic at heart, actually, to tell you the truth. But yeah, we all try. I think everybody tries to make a difference. I'm just saying, I don't think the book makes a change. It's
well, I mean, it makes a difference in terms of how people think. And
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is that people don't think the way you think.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was trying to say, that this is really a question of the methodology you use to study the problems of post-colonial India. Something that hasn't been done. We hear endlessly about colonialism as the cause of everything. We never talk about the rich, which I think you really have brought up. I mean, it does come up, but there's no sort of coherent discourse on this.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, Sheetal, thank you very much. This was an excellent and productive, I think this is an excellent project, and so good luck with it. And we all look forward to reading it shortly. And thank you for giving us your time.
Yeah, thank you
Take
all
care.
for coming, and be in touch if you would like.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Take
All the
care.
best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.